It's wonderful to be in this room with teachers and principals and curriculum specialists and leaders of professional organisations and others who dedicate their efforts to giving young Australians, especially the ones who do it very tough, every chance to succeed. So thank you for coming along to this event tonight. This centre was founded by a teacher of mathematics, Greg Lindsay, over 40 years ago. And we work proudly to fill research gaps and to deliver policy reforms that will bring real improvements in teaching and learning, so much of which depends on efficient and transparent funding. I'd like to take just a few minutes to frame this evening's panel discussion within the broader work of our education team. There's a lovely old saying that a rising tide lifts all boats. Let's just think about that in relation to education for a moment. How can Australia, a first world, wealthy, democratic nation built on the best of Western ideals, design and deliver the education needed to prepare young citizens for their post-school lives in the 21st century? It's the question that is occupying our minds every day all around the country. Our challenges are unique. A geographically remote, vast continent with a tiny, diverse population that includes many young learners whose first language is not English, whose location and socioeconomic backgrounds make schooling a challenge, and others who experience levels and types of disadvantage that really need clever policy solutions. Unfortunately, and taxpayers should be asking very hard questions about this, Australian education has experienced decades of major policy swings and has relied far too much on untested fads and trends. In spite of a massive increase in public funding, $60 billion to school education in 2018-2019, Aussie kids are not topping the academic charts. Based on NAPLAN statistics, 25% of this country's Year 10 students leave school with poor literacy and numeracy results. There were just under 300,000 Year 10 students in 2018, which means that about 75,000 young Australians cannot move into senior secondary education or the workforce with confidence. We know that Australia's 15-year-olds do not perform anywhere near as well as they should in the OECD's international assessments of mathematics, science, and reading. I'm sure many here, like us at CIS, are keen to see the next round of PISA results, which will come out in early December. To be absolutely clear, all students are disadvantaged by weak curriculum, poor teaching, and the ineffective spending of taxpayer dollars. As always, those who are born into healthy, happy, aspirational environments have the best chance of success. So what is the vision for Australian education? Where can we find the thoughtful acknowledgement of the effective practices of the past, as well as the detailed analysis of policy failures that have been avoided elsewhere in the world? My assertion is that Australia is currently stuck in a kind of education policy fog, still unwilling to really own the problems, still very vulnerable to the next shiny big thing that looks like it offers a solution. As we gather here tonight, there are at least 7 national education reviews underway, from early childhood to the teaching workforce, senior secondary pathways, some reflecting the recommendations of the Gonski Review and the Halsey Review into rural, regional and remote education, as well as the National School Reform Agreement. Or there are jurisdictional reviews, like the 6th review into NAPLAN being run by Queensland, WA and New South Wales. We've just seen an interim report as part of the review of the New South Wales curriculum. But in 2020, there is to be a review of the Australian curriculum. How does that work? These activities are siloed and uncoordinated. And we don't see a lot of evidence of proper sequencing according to an overarching timeline or vision. It's ad hoc, it's piecemeal, it's Band-Aid stuff. From now through the end of 2022, the CIS education team's work is designed to address key elements of school education in a very integrated way, so that we can develop policy recommendations that will lift all young Australians. Our research will focus on school funding and choice, and that's why we're gathering here tonight. Teacher training, national academic standards, assessment. We want to propose solutions to schooling that give every child the best chance to overcome the odds. And I think it's fair to say that the CIS has been a voice of reason in contributing to school funding debates to emphasise how rather than how much money is spent. Today we released a policy paper titled "What Do Parents Want from Schools?", which is the starting point for our research into school funding and school choice. And this evening, we'll hear from the paper's author, CIS Research Fellow Glenn Fahey. The panel, which I'll introduce in a moment, will explore that topic, and then I'll invite questions from you, from the audience. So please be thinking up the curliest questions that you can. It's my great pleasure now to introduce our panellists for tonight and ask them to take their places on the podium. Dallas McInerney, CEO of Catholic Schools New South Wales. Welcome, Dallas. You're right there. Michael Nuttall, Executive Officer of the Australian Primary Principals Association. And Dianne Giblin, CEO of the Australian Council of State School Organisations. And I'd like to hand over to Glenn for the next section of this evening's agenda. Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks everybody for being here tonight. School choice and school funding, the areas in which I look after here in the CIS program of research, are understandably among the key areas of CIS research on education policy, and they have been for the CIS's entire history. We take an interest in these topics, not only because they're indispensable to reasoned education policy debate at any time, but also because it's intrinsic to the CIS's DNA. And that's because educational freedom is integral to the CIS's vision of a freer and more open society. And we see smart use of public funding of all sorts, and especially that with an important public investment like education, as key to effective government. Tonight I'll introduce some findings from recent polling commissioned by the CIS, and that's this paper here, What Do Parents Want from Schools?, released just today, which looks at parents' perspectives into school choice and resourcing here in Australia. The Insight helps light a torch for the CIS program of research that aims to provide policy solutions to bring about a freer and more open society when it comes to education. To us, it's parents' views that need to be heard more by policymakers, not the same loud vested interests that have dominated education policy for as long as anyone can remember. Even educators that suffer with their share of the most overzealous and naggy parents would have to agree that at the end of the day, parents remain the key stakeholder when it comes to education and the guardian of their child's welfare. And speaking of parents, it brings me to the results of this research. When it comes to funding, parents told us that they're not concerned about the levels of funding, despite policymakers' infatuation with funding boosts as a solution to all educational problems. In particular, 88% of parents across the country say their chosen school has enough or more than enough resources. And that includes 86% for those in the government school sector. This is important in the context of tonight's topic on choice, because so often when we talk about choice, we're met with a counterproductive recourse to so-called funding wars between the sectors. In our research, it's reassuring to see that the conclusions about funding are more or less the same, irrespective of the sector of school that parents have chosen. As the CIS has long argued, The extent to which to the extent to which there's inequality within school funding in Australia, it's by a postcode rather than by sector. And that brings me to the issue of choice. What was perhaps most striking in our research was that 2 in 5 parents across the country wouldn't endorse the chosen school. That means that around 1.6 million students across Australia are in a school that their parents aren't happy with. If this were the equivalent of an Uber ban in schools, then they'd be off the road by now. But, and at the risk of introducing an intersectoral fire, it does appear that parents are happier when they've chosen a non-government school than those that have chosen a government school. Something that members of tonight's panel may have some reflections on. Now, detailed soul searching about why so many parents aren't happy with their chosen school is beyond the scope of a single survey. But no doubt people in the room and certainly members of the panel will have their insights. In a broad sense, I think it's useful to frame the issue in terms of 2 different sets of parents when we're talking on this topic. And that's because there's different kinds of policy implications that should apply. The first group of parents that were limited in their choices to start with, meaning they're unable to pick their preferred school or they've had to go to extensive lengths in order to do so. Polling indicates that this may represent around 2/3 of parents in Australia, and 1 in 5 that say that they're very limited when it comes to choosing a school. Often it's barriers like location and cost that get in the way. They have their own reasons why they may also be unhappy with their choice, and if they had their time again, unconstrained by those barriers, they may clearly have another preference in mind. But this is where policymakers have got some work to do in relieving some of the burdens that are caused by location and cost. Some are inevitably unable to be resolved, the tyranny of distance, particularly in rural Australia. But many have solutions that are available to policymakers. And at the moment, it's clear that in many ways, government is more the problem than the solution when it comes to choice enabling. When it comes to cost, our convoluted funding structure is a very indirect way of providing financial assistance to parents in order to overcome burdens of cost. When it comes to location, governments provide a mandate on where parents can and can't send their children. And the place of that in a free and open society has to be something that we question. The second set of parents are those that did get into their preferred school, but are disappointed with that experience. We might call these the classic case of buyer's remorse parents. And there's a couple of implications for policy there too. One is that we could help parents to make more informed choices of school in the first place. And that sounds simple. It's a make customers more aware and they'll make better decisions argument. But it's important that parents have a clearer idea and expectations about the schools that they're getting into, because it can be quite hard to transition out of schools once they're set up. In our research, we asked parents about what information they sought in helping make their choice of school. Word of mouth and visiting schools are the most popular sources of information, and a majority of parents use these as recourses in making their decisions. Visiting school websites, meeting with school staff, and using independent tools like the My School website are used by many parents, but by no means a majority. Yet the traditionally relied upon resources, particularly word of mouth, is particularly an unreliable source of information for making decisions about your child. And it's important that more parents take a more independent look at schools and make up their own conclusions by things like attending the school, meeting staff, and in particular making use of validation tools like the My School website. And our research shows that parents that do take steps like this tend to make choices that they're happier with. Another implication is to give parents more of a say in how schools are run. And this is particularly true for parents that don't have an alternative school that they could jump ship to. If you can't change it, fix it. And it does appear that in Australia, many more parents are willing to take a more active role in governing their schools. Today, there's over 770 schools in the country that are called independent public schools, which operate under the government school umbrella, but they've got school boards made up of parents of the community that take an active interest in the decisions made at school. that so many parents and so many schools are willing to take such a step voluntarily is encouraging and should encourage policymakers to consider expanding options like this within the government school sector. Our research told us, and here I'm bringing resourcing back into the fold, that parents who chose a non-government school felt more confident in the school's use of resources. And this might have something to do with more flexible and devolved forms of spending decisions that typically are typical of independent schools in particular, and of course are at odds with many centrally determined spending decisions in government schools. There's something to this flexibility and local decision making that seems to be resonating in parents' decisions about confidence in the use of resources. So making government schools more flexible is certainly something that needs to be on the table. And to close this address, I would like to take a minute to reiterate that it really is our vision that families of all kinds, not just those that are wealthy, and not just those that have had the privilege of a great education of their own, gain better access to choice when it comes to picking schools. We would hope that this will cut down the number of Australian parents who experience buyer's remorse, and more importantly, young learners that feel a misfit when it comes to their education. I dare say we won't resolve all issues about school choice here tonight, but I would hope that we can get a little further along the line here. And I think that makes it time for our panel discussion.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you, Glenn. So we're looking forward to a robust and friendly and energetic debate tonight. And once again, I'd like to welcome Dallas, Michael and Di to the panel, who no doubt have between them probably more experiences than the rest of us in terms of dealing with government and trying to manage policy as it's rolled out and all of the challenges that come to representatives and leaders of organisations such as theirs. So I'm starting with a slightly, what did you call it, Glenn, clunky question. I have to just provide a little bit of context, so please bear with me. It's a little bit long, but it's a question for our three guests tonight to try and set the scene. Given that we have a long-standing national commitment in Australia, it's unique in world terms, to school choice, a tripartite model that all governments have agreed to, so in place for 60 years or so, which states that every child is entitled to a base level of public funding towards their education. And given that this gives parents and students access to government schools, Catholic schools and independent schools, and given that we have agreement on a dollar figure of about $11,500 per primary student, and about $14,500 per secondary student. And given that we have seen taxpayer funding increase enormously over the last decade, as I mentioned before, $60 billion in this financial year, and we now have a commitment to needs-based funding that puts a clear focus on disadvantage, so targeting the students who need that support most. Why are we still talking about school funding and school choice? Dallas, if I may start with you.
Thank you. Everyone. I have to start by acknowledging the CIS and putting on this forum their history and breadth of expertise across so many policy areas makes it an adornment to this city and its cultural fabric. So Tom and the team and Blaze, thank you very much. I'd much rather not talk about funding at all. And in fact, after we signed a 10-year funding agreement with the government last year, from 2018 through a decade hence, we're in pretty much a steady state. The more interesting conversation to have now is what are we going to do with that money? And I think no matter what sector you're in or represent, there's a, dare I say it, a lack of maturity on the part of the leaders in the school sector who aren't ready for a public debate which is already on our doorstep. And it's an input-output equation. After wailing and lobbying and screaming for more money for the best part of a decade, and now we have record levels of funding, the more money is now in Australian schools in the history of the Commonwealth. It's not unexpected that policymakers who agreed to the proposition that we put to them now turn and say, you have your inputs. We're going to have a zero-like focus on your, we're going to zero in on your outputs now. That's standardised testing. That's a whole bunch of other indices. Efficiency, effectiveness, well-being. And this is not a proposition which sits comfortably in traditional education conversations. But if we don't get used to it, I think we're going to do ourselves a great disservice. So to answer the question, I'd like not to talk about funding in a quantum for too much longer, because I think that we are well resourced. The other part of the funding debate we might have to return to is the very real possibility this is the last generation of school attendees who will be so well resourced by their government. As the bell curve of the age profile of this country keeps shifting up to 60 plus, and we're servicing the 5 to 10 or 5 to 15 sector, there's less and less and a bigger demand at the other end of the age bell curve. Then the policy shift, the focus and the resources will shift up there. So we are, in some measures, in clover. We are swimming in gravy. That may not be
You'll be quoted on that,
proposition shared
You'll be swimming in
by
gravy.
other people on the panel, but we are well resourced, and we have to make sure we make the most of it.
Thank you, Fiona. It's a it's a good question. Why we do continue to seem to be having an ongoing debate about school funding, but look, with the Australian Primary Principals Association, who I'm with, our approach is first up in terms of school funding, is that school funding has been settled. The agreements are in place, but more so in terms of school choice. We have readily acknowledged that choice is a big part of the Australian education system, and we support parents' rights to choose the best school for their child. In terms of do we have enough funding? Well, I think the debate finishes, and then what we should be looking at is how we can say that our schools are focused on producing quality education for every child in them. And I also think there's a little bit of a separation when we do throw primary schools in with secondary schools. And I think we have to sort of move a little bit away from that, because there is a distinct difference between the primary school arrangement, where you've got children in a school in their local community, probably having a fairly effective parental engagement and understanding of what the children in that school need. Whereas the secondary schooling moves a little bit outside that sort of local community approach to things. So I think we do need to say that and looking at the figures that came out there, Glenn, I'd be interested to know what the difference is between primary and secondary parents, what they think of their school, because I'd think, and I might be guessing here, but I'd have an educated guess in saying that I think most parents are generally very satisfied with their primary school. I can see some nods in the crowd, and that would be whether they're in a government school, a Catholic school, or an independent school.
I can add to that yes, parents are reporting higher levels of satisfaction in primary, and lowest at senior secondary level. So I think that there's something we've got to ask about why that might be, and this can be around, with parents being unsatisfied. Is it around the kind of subject selections available for senior secondary? Is it to do with the pressures that are being faced? Is there pressure on on teachers that's being reflected? Because of course it can be a more demanding experience on the school side as well. But it's something that I think is an important distinction to make, that yes, different stages of schooling face different challenges, and as part of our ongoing work, of course, that's the kind of thing we would drill into.
I think it's a good thing to look at, and it could also be that parents have these wonderful dreams for their child in the younger years, and they put them in a school, and their children are very amenable and healthy and happy, and then as they discover later on they're not going to be a pilot or a doctor, they parents get a little bit upset with the result of all that education.
They actually turn into teenagers. I think it's more.
Over to you, Di. Yes.
Well, I'm the one swimming in the gravy. Is that correct? And for us, it's a bit muddy. But of course, you know, our mantra of the Australian Council of State School Organisation has a mantra of funding being fair, simple, and transparent, and things that families can understand, and that sometimes some of the funding arrangements to parents seem a little bit more equal in some sectors and not in others. For us, absolutely, we do believe in parental choice, and that parents can choose where they send their child. But we preface that with saying that every child in the country should be receiving a high quality education where they have access and opportunity. And we particularly talk about our rural and remote schools when we talk about this as well. We know that families don't often choose their anything but their local primary school, and we often encourage families to say that the early years are the key, and that's where we should be as families concerned. For us, family engagement is one of the most important and one of the most well-researched and one of the most not talked about things for parents. Where the relationships are strong, where the connections are strong, then we can see the success in our kids, and where the schools are willing to speak with us. As far as decision making, yes, we've seen a lot of independent public schools starting out, and we know that the models in Western Australia are not as happy as what they had first originally planned to be. In speaking with a colleague this morning, Queensland independent public schools seem to be working well. We know in New South Wales there was a big surge of school councils in the 80s and 90s, and I was actually one of the instrumental people to dismantle those because of the parent voice not quite getting through the way that it should. So I think I've muddled up the answer there, but to say that probably from our perspective, we may not stop talking about funding quite to the extent, but we understand that what needs to happen now, because, well, for one, there's no guarantee of 100% SRS for public schools. It's 95%, so we're not particularly overwhelmed with that. Well, we're not at all happy with that. We want the states and territories to step up to the mark and ensure that there's 100% SRS for public education, and that nothing less should be accepted. I might leave it there for the moment anyway.
And that's a key point to make, isn't it? We always need to be reminded that ultimately the taxpayer dollars are funneled through the states and territories and distributed by them. So it's very important to remember that the devolution of responsibility for funding happens in very real terms, and Glenn can talk more about that a little bit later.
I think just to add on that some of the things in the funding agreement not necessarily always go directly to public education. I mean, some of the student transport, whilst it sits in that 95, that percentage that goes to public schools is not necessarily always targeting public school kids.
Any comment from you, Glenn, before we...
I think only to add, so if to ask the question why are we still talking about the same issue and beating the same drum over and over, if I can plug our research yet again, this seemed to say to us that spending priorities that policymakers have pushed don't seem to be the same priorities that parents are expressing. So in our poll, parents were more likely to express a need for more funding on infrastructure and facilities in schools, and on providing more extracurricular activities in schools. At the same time, the priorities that have been expressed by policymakers for the last 10 years, 20 years or more have been around reducing class sizes, have been around providing really an army of support staff in schools, and in endlessly increasing teachers' wages. Now, these are all important priorities, and don't get me wrong, but when it comes to why we're still asking this question, perhaps it is that parents aren't quite happy and the systems aren't making decisions that are in line with what parents think.
No doubt we'll return to that, and there may be some questions from parents and others in the audience about the very particular funding decisions that schools, principals should make. I'd like to move to you again, Michael, if I may, with a question about school choice. So we'll leave funding, Dallas, and move right into choice. Michael is in a particularly rich situation in terms of the experience of choice. And I won't say any more. I'll just leave it to you to tell us about that.
Well, I'll quickly touch on my own as a child. The choice for me was growing up in a large Catholic family was go to the local parish primary school and go to the local the local high school. I then moved into a government school for year 11 and 12. All very good, very happy with all of it. But when I began at working for APA, one of the things I was able to say is that I had a child in each system: government school, Catholic school, and an independent school. It was an independent Catholic school, but was sort of drawn that way. And the choice, being able to make a choice, and it wasn't always necessarily a choice made by the parents. By the time the child gets to, our daughter got to year 10, she decided that she would move from where she was into a government senior college, and I'd say that worked exceptionally well for her. She was the second eldest. The eldest girl was in a secondary girls' school, went from 7 to 12, and she'd decided to stay, whilst a couple of her close friends, very close friends, moved to that same government secondary school. But she was very happy where she was. And our two boys, we gave them a choice as they finished year 10. Where would you like to go? One applied for the government secondary school and was accepted, but decided to stay where he was. So I think it's worked well for us as a family. We'd be very satisfied with the education they received, and I think we could also say that the values of the schools aligned quite strongly with ours.
So you were in an urban setting where all of those choices were available to you. Is that right? Easily available, and within the sort of easy commuting distance.
Yeah, readily available, and I think that's a particular advantage of living in a capital city or a large regional town. You have choice, which you possibly won't get in a more isolated or other smaller rural settings. But I think having that choice was a good thing.
And we had some interesting feedback on commuting times, didn't we, Glenn? Do you mind just pointing to those for a moment?
Yeah, so I mean, there's often been a complaint that, and including a recent argument peddled a few weeks ago, that parents that don't choose a local school are responsible for unduly contributing toward congestion in our cities.
Traffic congestion, yes.
Traffic congestion, to be clear, not other forms of congestion. Which seems a puzzling argument, but one question that we asked was around parents whether they chose the closest school to home or not, and we asked them about their commuting times. And of course, yes, parents that don't choose a local school on average have a longer commute. That's to be expected, but it's not dramatically more. So most parents that choose a local school are commuting for under 10 minutes. Most parents that go to the non-local school are travelling for 10 to 20 minutes. That to me, and that's a daily trip. So that to me doesn't seem to meet the level of objection that some have made in that respect.
Di, if I could move to you with a question, and I'm going to quote briefly from an article in the press from the 11th of August this year about New South Wales cracking down on out-of-area enrolments. And I quote, "This would be an easier policy to defend if all public schools were equal, but they are not. Reputation is a spurious way to judge a school, to choose a school. But other differences between public schools are real and worrying to parents. Some have brand new state-of-the-art buildings. Others haven't been upgraded in decades. Some have outstanding principals who inspire their teachers, which translates to high-quality learning for students. Others don't. Curtailing choice will not go down well with families. And I'm just wondering, Di, would you have a comment on this zoning out-of-area enrolments issue that is so much a feature of discussion at the moment?
It's interesting, actually. I was at Parents Victoria conference yesterday, and this actually came up as one of the conversation pieces, that families were concerned that they were being locked into the local school. And I mean, the ideal answer to that is to have a high quality, well facilitated local public school. That's the answer. It's not the reality, unfortunately. And I was actually only speaking to my husband this morning, who's a secondary teacher, and about the conversation you had about how families choose their school and what do they base it on. And I can assure you that I live in Western Sydney, which has its fair share of affordable non-govs as well as public schools, and the Cambridge Park Warrington Downs Facebook page is where people often go to choose their school, and it's based on what is seen as to be in their local environment and what is not. So some of what you said of people visiting schools, and unfortunately the My School website doesn't often rank when people are choosing, its word of mouth. There are pluses and minuses to the zoning. I think there is the ability to use the demographics to predict and to ensure that we provide great services to local kids. And then there is, of course, the issue of families where sometimes needs are not met, where one child may need special support in another school, and then the siblings can't join them in those schools. So that was the conversation actually yesterday. And the other one, of course, is the logic of sometimes the school that you're zoned in technically is further away than your school that's very close. And it gets rezoned quite often to the point where I know one of my children, and we won't hold them to this, got their children into the local school on the grounds that I was the pickup point, which I am, and I'm in the local school, but they're just out. Well, now I'm out of it too. So that means that siblings that follow. So I think for family connections, I think we need to be a little bit more flexible with that sort of way, and meeting the needs of families, because often there are two working families. They may be dropping off and picking up, and the moving around of that. But I can understand some of the practicalities of it in the sense of being able to predict demographics. The other about the resourcing, absolutely. We've seen, the largest growth is in public education, according to the ABS data, but we're probably the smallest amount of new schools being built in particular areas. And again, I'll quote Penrith only because I know it so well. Jordan Springs School is still another 3 years away, and kids are being transported across probably 3 to 4 Ks, which doesn't sound a lot, I know, but in Penrith traffic it's quite a considerable amount of time, to passing some government schools to go to another one because of the fact that we don't have that infrastructure. And I suppose it's not adding insult to industry, but it's not adding insult, I suppose, but often we will, our public schools will hire the non-government school hall for functions. And again, that it's not an envy or anything along that lines. It's just, why don't we have that resource? And why aren't those resources provided? So some of our government schools are in great need of upgrade and great need of new structures to support them.
What is the delay? Would you say? How would you explain the 3-year delay, for example, in providing a new school? Di, I mean, what needs to happen? Is government simply not responding quickly enough?
I think that's the answer. That where the money comes from these schools, there's a huge population growth in many of these outer Sydney areas. Lots of McMansions, I suppose we often refer to them out our way, or granny flats, townhouses. Huge population growth. I think it's probably tripled in Western and Southwestern Sydney over the last few years, and the schools are not meeting up with the growth. the public schools are not meeting the growth. You've got, we've got demountables on football fields, and that's not adequate, and that's not what our kids deserve.
And of course, parents can't wait 3 years, so they
No,
will.
that's right. No, and they're not, not in a position to pack up and move to get to a school. They're choosing their local school because their local school is their choice, and their local school's available to them. And I mean, building on to what you said, that when we've asked parents what is the first thing that you look at when you're looking at choosing a school, it's location, locality, and making sure it meets the needs of my child and my family. And I think when we've got zoning, sometimes it doesn't meet the needs of some families.
Dallas, I know I said I wouldn't use the F word again, but I do have to go back to it because I do have a question that was put to me as an important one to ask, and it is key to this discussion about choice. If we want parents to have genuine choice, and we want to make sure that the school they choose is the best possible fit for their child, how do we make sure that fees don't increase to the point where they become unaffordable, but at the same time the perception is that subsidies are increasing? So we've got, in a sense, unaffordable places or unaffordable schools, fees increasing, but this vast amount of money being poured into the various systems. How does that work?
I'll answer your question, but let me go back to some first principles, and if you do want some blood sports up here, this might provoke it. To be frank, the only reason choice is a feature of the Australian school landscape is because of Catholic schools, in the main, predominantly. We have a national network of almost 1,800 schools right across every point of the compass, every state in the Commonwealth, with another 70 schools planned for the next 5 years. Now, which makes our system globally unique. We have a parallel system of low-fee, affordable schools sitting next door, quite literally, to the government school public offering, free and secular as it is. Without that network of low-fee schools, we wouldn't be experiencing the choice that we're talking about here today. There's a bit of growth from the independents, and that's terrific as well. Our view has always been that we support a well-resourced school sector, no matter what denomination, if it's secular or if it's a government school. There is a rising national dividend to be had and experienced through a well-resourced school sector. Our care for kids in public schools, it doesn't stop just because they don't wear our uniform. There's 300,000 plus Catholic kids sitting in public schools today. So we have a real keen interest that their learning outcomes, their pastoral journey is all that it can be. So, the wasted energy of years past of friction between the sectors, I think it doesn't behove us to carry that forward. We have through this network of low-fee, affordable schools right across the country, avoided the worst form of postcode determinism, which you see in other parts of the world, particularly the United States, where they have to uproot themselves, move to a different school district, and then try and access a better school option there. This is a personal view. If I had my way, I'd get rid of any school boundaries, any school district, no matter the sector. Too often it can serve just to inoculate a particular school from competitive tension when people want to go elsewhere. They've got a captured market. So, and the reason school choice is so important regarding, related districts is because it is an off-ramp to, it's an escape route out of a really poor school educational setting, and it's an on-ramp to an opportunity to another. And we should defend that as a feature of the Australian school system for as long as we've got breath. And I think we do that well. And and I think the Catholic system has done the heavy lifting around that. So, and will continue to do so. If you want to come back to the funding issue, there is a tax on choice in this country. This year alone, Catholic parents and families will pay $3 billion in fees and capital levies to exercise a choice not to go to the government school, but say, we're going to go to this school. So the fees effectively is a tax on their choice, but it's a tax they're willing to pay and have done for many decades. So I think we're at a point of a policy settlement, if you like. There's an equilibrium where we understand the different offerings across the three sectors. They're well resourced, and we're not trying to, climb on top of each other at the expense of somebody else. There's space for us all, but anything where you have a compulsory activity mandated by government, you need to put a competitive tension into the dynamic, and that's exactly what school choice does. And the Catholic school, the public school on this side of the road, is a much better school for the presence of the Catholic school on the other side, and vice versa. And there was some mention around the transport options. It's not only in metro. If you were to drop a pin, right? If you go down to car park at Stanmore Macca's, you finish revving up your WRX, but you thought, okay, what schools have I got around here? There's 4 or 5 Catholic parish schools you can get to really easily, from Leichhardt to Annandale to Stanmore. You could go down to some big independent congregational schools. You've got Newington and Scholastica's. You've got some terrific public schools around the place. You can do that. You go to a regional town like Bathurst, and you're again spoiled for choice. Parish schools, congregational schools, independent schools, non-denominational schools. And I think if we spend more time celebrating that and the dividends that choice delivers, I think we'll find much more agreement from between the sectors than you might think.
So do you think, and this is a general question, is the problem really about lack of diversity within the government sector?
I think some of the fiercest competitive tension you see in the Australian school system is inside the government sector. I mean, the cottage industry to get into a selective government high school is phenomenal and not at all healthy, I'd venture. Similarly with the selective state sports high schools. So there's an enormous amount of competition to get in so inside the government sector itself. Before you even get to between the sectors.
Although New South Wales is quite distinctive in that way. That is not a national picture. Michael, do you hear complaints about fee increases in the non-government sector while all this money is pouring in from taxpayers?
Look, we certainly don't hear it because there's money pouring in. I think over the last decade or more that fees in a number of independent schools have gone up considerably, and I guess that's possibly a product of general affluence of the Australian community. We're a wealthy country. We've got parents, quite often 2 income or a single income that's quite high, and I think schools have positioned themselves to be able to do that. I don't think that's the case in the Catholic schools. I mean, for a Catholic education, and I've been there and been a principal in the Catholic system and things, that it does offer, as Diane said, it does offer an affordable option for parents. I guess it's part of the choice. People can sort of say, I'm prepared to put in this amount of money for what that school offers, and those schools do offer facilities, do offer the extra co-curricular and the like that a lot of parents yearn for, and so they would see it as value for money. So I don't think people sit back and go, oh no, it's the fees are going up by 5% or 10% or whatever.
Schools have waiting lists, right? So obviously there's no problem with the parents.
No.
Glenn, any
But
thoughts
it's not fair to say that the funding has increased above costs, right, year on year, at the same time that fees have also been increasing. And if the sectors are awash with money, then I think there is a reasonable reason to ask, why aren't parents seeing fee relief, right? And I think that's something that we've got to put into context, is that if we are genuine about affordability and access for non-government alternatives. And yes, there are some very successful low-fee options in the Catholic sector, but we certainly can't generalise that and extrapolate across the whole of the non-government sectors that say that, yes, schools are now X more affordable as a result of increases of funding. And I think that's something that we should be concerned a bit about.
Advocating price controls, are you?
Look, by no means, but there seems to be an issue here that it's more that supply seems to be constrained. It's more an argument that we need more options in the non-government sector than anything to try to release some of that ability for, I guess, for want of a better term, monopoly pricing that is currently in place.
And I wouldn't say that there are not fees in a government school.
Sure.
And there are kids excluded from things because of some things that need. And I don't want to go down this path, particularly for you, Dallas, but I sit on the Public Education Foundation scholarships, and I've read in the last 12 days, I've read some 230 applications for scholarships. These are people that choice is their local public school, but even to access education and the things that are required for them to be successful and to participate in their local government school requires these scholarships. I think, yes, I understand what Michael's saying, that some people are prepared to pay, blah, blah, blah. There are people that just doesn't happen for, and is not even in the equation, and are applying for scholarships for them to be able to participate fully in their local government school. So I just needed to put that on the table, because I've read some quite heartbreaking stories over the past 2 weeks of young people, including a kindergarten scholarship where there was 97 applications for kindergarten kids. So, I just need that picture to be painted a little bit more clearly.
One last question. OECD statistics show that Australia has more than double the number of students in non-government schools across the world. A third of our students go to private schools, and of those, well over half are in Catholic schools. Why is Australia an international outlier in this way?
International outlier, international leader.
That's a perspective.
I think you have to go back to the historical formation of education in this country. Quite often, the first non-government schools put down were Catholic, and they anchored country towns and regions, sometimes many decades before there was a government school presence. And they did this all free of government abetment off their own bat and voluntary workforce. So I think once you having that as a foundational feature of the early history, not only of schooling but of the nation itself, then it grew from there. And they obviously generations came to like what they saw and experienced. And there has been some significant attempts to try and undercut the validation of school choice and its provision right up until the High Court and the Dogs case. So, but it's persisted, it's endured, because it has widespread public support amongst parents. There's an acknowledgement inside the policy community that by funding modestly as it does the non-government sector, there is still a net saving to government. When we, for example, as the Catholic sector say, actually, you have a 100% obligation enshrined in legislation that for every kid that presents themselves in New South Wales, you must provide a spot for them. And that's enshrined in law. That's an obligation on the State Department. We say, you know what, we're going to take around 20% of the market, us Catholics, and we're going to do some heavy lifting for you. And so it's a massive relief off the budget for the state government. And but I hear what Di says. We will make sure the resources are there. And it's a luxury we have. When someone comes to one of our schools, we can't fit them in, we have a waiting list. When they come to one of the Di schools, there's a demountable. And that's not something we should accept.
Michael, why do you think? Is it habit? Tradition?
There's not a lot that I can add to Dallas's comments. It is the system we've got. It's served well, and that's not to say that we shouldn't have a strong focus on having a quality education for every child, no matter what school they're in. And some parents will make the choice of a high fee paying independent school or a low fee paying Catholic school or a government school. I think it's it's imperative, and I see the saving for the government in terms of a couple of those options. I do appreciate that, but I think one of the tragedies of Australian education is the demise, in some sense, and it may be something that's particular to New South Wales, is whether demise is the right word, of the comprehensive government high school, where when I went to my local school, local government high school for year 11 and 12, I was in a wonderful mix of people. I don't know that that's available for everyone, and there's times where we see strong advocates for government schools, and so there should be, because every school should be a good school and provide a quality education. But there may be not seeing what's happening and appreciating that where they have their own children or their own experiences are quite different from what might be there in the outer suburbs of Sydney or in some of the battling country towns. And so we need, all three of us here, I think we'd all be strong advocates for all schools to be good schools, for our government system to be as strong as it can be, and sure, allow parents to make a choice across three sectors. I think it's not unreasonable.
Di, do you have any final thoughts on
Like
why
the odd man on the table here, or woman? Probably just one thing I would echo Michael's comments about the local comprehensive high school. I think market forces and aspiration has had a lot to do with the I wouldn't say destruction, but the demise of the local comprehensive high school. I'm a firm advocate for that. My children all went to the local comprehensive high school. My grandchildren go to the local comprehensive high school. Just I would say that the comments on savings, what cost is it to a country where every young child doesn't get the full access and opportunity to be the best they can be? And I believe that that's where we should be sending our priorities, looking at our early childhood area and ensuring that every child has access and opportunity to be the best they can be. Otherwise, that's where we're going to not have savings in the future for our country.
Thank you, Di. I'd like to open the questions up to the audience just for a few moments. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks. This is to Glenn, but maybe Michael has a view as well. I was just trying to work out from, and I haven't had a chance really to read this report, but I think it's really great that the CIS have done this, so congratulations to you for that. To really work out the driving force for people, or for parents moving, going to private rather than public, and I'm particularly interested in whether it's the attractions of a private school or the problems in the public school system. So, and I was looking, Glenn, at your Appendix 3 here just very quickly, and you've got 8% of respondents said that religion was the most important thing, and I would have expected probably that would be quite a bit higher given the number of people going to Catholic schools and schools like the Church of England, and also looking at that table, we've got an academic focus, 34%, and I'm interested in whether parents just don't feel that they're getting that in the public system or not, and the 90% were concerned about school discipline and whether, again, that's something that's a problem in the public schools or it's a particular attraction for private schools, and it ties in with something Michael said, I think, about the competition, between public and private, and even the selective schools that were referred to, whether that's another driver, that if people don't have confidence in their public, comprehensive public school, that they're really trying to find another way to get out. So I suppose that's my point of curiosity, does your data tell us a lot about this?
So there's a lot in there. In terms of the question about what's driving people's decisions, the push and pull kind of factors, we don't cover that in terms of this particular survey, but of course it's an important question about particularly people at the margin of the decision making about what drives kind of that marginal choice. Perhaps it's a subject of future research of ours. But in terms of some of these factors that you listed, so one, taking discipline for instance, parents that ultimately chose a Catholic school were much more likely to preference discipline, which is quite interesting, that parents that have got a discipline focus are more likely to preference a Catholic choice. Around academic focus, I couldn't say it was sort of either way, because of course there's a lot of academic focus is still an important part of selective schools in particular. Elements of cost is another consideration in there. Parents, of course, that considered cost high on their priority list were more likely to select a government school, and that's probably to be expected. And in terms of religion, so yes, the religion numbers were relatively low, and that's because we asked about what are the priorities for your choice of school, and we listed the top 3 amongst the list. So yes, it's true that many more parents choose a non-government school, which also is often a religious school. A subset of them also are a religious household, and a subset of them see religion as a key reason driving that decision. So that's why that's probably a little lower than you might have expected.
I was involved in a discussion some time back about those sorts of questions. Why would you move and things? I think in what came out a little bit was there's a certain advantage that can sit in an independent school and a Catholic school, in that they have a tradition that's travelled over. You know, if you're an independent school, it's could be a Christian school, or could be just a secular school. It's been going for a number of years, and it's held fast to a particular way of doing things and a way of teaching, even, and certainly a charism or whatever. So the Catholic schools have sort of the Catholic Church underpinning how they operate and the way they work with people and families and children and things. And I think in some ways, and it might be a bit controversial here, but government schools can be a bit of a movable feast with the change of leadership and things, whereas if I walk into a Catholic school as a principal, I kind of have to operate the way that I'm the way that I have to, given its teachings and understanding of how it deals with people and things. And occasionally there could be situations where in a school where there's a change in leadership, or a constant change, or a number of changes in leadership, it doesn't have that sort of glue that holds the organisation together. So it is an advantage, I think, that Catholic schools and independent schools hold. And that's why my belief is that really we have to look at all schools being quality schools. So government schools, that should be, when you walk into a school as a school leader, I'm here to lead a school that's producing the best education it can for the children, based on evidence, based on experiences of other schools and what you can learn from others and all that sort of thing, but not chopping and changing, or following a particular fad or whatever, as is seen from time to time.
You've partly answered my question, but I wonder why you haven't done some research on this particular question. I'm a grandparent now, so I'm pretty glad of that. I think my kids have got a much more difficult problem than I have. But I think, and again it's anecdotal evidence, but I think that many parents choose a school based on the ability of the teacher to give some discipline in class so that he can control the kids and effectively teach. Why haven't you done research on that? Or do you think that parents don't use that as a difficult choice?
We have done some research in the last 12 months that's looked at what sort of factors help schools overcome particularly disadvantage. And these are schools that are high performing despite coming from a disadvantaged background. And one of the key findings of that was that discipline is a key ingredient in essentially overcoming the odds that's particularly students with disadvantage faced. But of course it's true, across all schools, that perhaps a level of discipline is less existent in the education system today than it has been in the past.
was pretty wild in the 70s at times.
Hello, I have a question about funding. The F word again. So I was reading a report this morning about OECD countries and the amount of government spending as a percentage of all government spending that goes to education. And it found that Australia was number 9, substantially above average. How does that correspond with our rankings for quality of education? I'm from America, as you can tell, and one of the things that President Obama is famous for saying when he was petitioning for more government spending was that students can't learn in a trailer, but my entire education was in a portable trailer. So I'm a little bit biased. So is there a much correspondence between quality of education and the quantity of money we're spending on that education?
And luckily, we have someone who has recently returned from working in Paris with the OECD, so very familiar with these statistics.
So the figures you're referring to are from what's called the Education at a Glance publication of the OECD. Look, the OECD has said for many years now that a simplistic comparison of overall resourcing, irrespective of the measure you pick, and there are a range to choose from, and I won't bore people with the details of those, but whichever one you pick, there's little to no association between overall achievement in test scores. And by test scores, we usually refer to the PISA testing that the OECD conducts. Of course, that's a simplistic high level. That's not to say that particular cases funding can help, and in other cases that funding is useless to educational achievement, or of course that all educational achievement can be summed up in a single test. It's an indicator, and like all other indicators, it does point to Australia having relatively high expenditure on schooling, and also relatively poor achievement overall.
So I'm from the Australian Indigenous Education Foundation. We provide scholarships for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids to go to boarding schools, and we've supported over 1,000 kids in the last 10 years with scholarship funding for those boarding schools. And the entire rationale of what we do is parental choice. We don't do any marketing or recruiting or whatever. Every applicant comes to us through their own research and word of mouth and so on, and we don't visit communities and try to enrol or recruit or sell scholarships at all. And yet for every scholarship we have available, there's something like 30, 40, 50 applicants. And so the demand far outstrips supply. And the interesting thing is about 70% or more of our kids come from rural, remote and very remote communities. And as you all say, and we all agree with, all schools should be great schools, but the reality doesn't currently match that. And, we've been achieving great results. Those kids are achieving retention year 12 completion rates over 90% and similar transition rates into careers and university. And I'm interested, I suppose, in when it comes to the issue of parental choice. When you look at what those barriers are for particularly people from marginalised, vulnerable and disadvantaged backgrounds, of which there are many in the Indigenous communities, when you take away the financial barrier, which is what our job is to do, that demand is enormous. And I guess two things I'm interested in. One is that whether this issue of choice is even greater for families in lower socioeconomic circumstances, because, families who have got access to choices, and the families that are in the lower income brackets don't have those access. And so that whole question seems to be much more important for those families who can't afford to make the choice. And as we see, when you remove the financial barriers, we can't keep up with demand for that. And secondly, I guess whether there's any particular focus you've done on the research there or planning to do on the research, and we'd be happy to collaborate if you want in the future, but around Indigenous families, particularly in rural, very remote communities. And one of the interesting things is that, there's a great sort of ideological resistance from, the expected kind of quarters, which is not large in number but loud in voice, about Aboriginal kids should stay in their communities and all this sort of nonsense that basically seeks to be paternalistic to Indigenous families who want to make choices. No, we don't think you should be able to make that choice. We want to tell you where your kids should be educated. But no one says that when they're talking about farmers' kids or country politicians' kids or miners who work in remote communities. But if you're black and poor, people want to tell you where you should educate your kids. So we've got to get this ideology out of it as well. So I guess I'm interested in your perspectives on, you know, the choice issue, particularly for poorer families, and whether there's anything specific you're looking at with boarding schools and or Indigenous families and students.
First and foremost, may I say thank you very much for the offer to collaborate, because that's one of the wonderful things that comes out of these opportunities. We have these events so that we can bring as many people to these discussions as possible, and yes, we would welcome that opportunity. Yes, it is absolutely in the plan. Blaise Joseph, who's sitting right here at the front, who is well known to so many, is embarking on a very important area of research around precisely what you have just described, looking at high Indigenous enrolment schools in particular, and where there is excellent academic achievement and how that happens, and expanding that then, of course, into rural and remote locations, and making sure that there are policies coming out of that research that will be of benefit much more broadly, because it's so important to distinguish between urban and remote and rural. But Glenn, did you want to add anything in terms of the research we're doing around school choice?
Probably one point to make, and I applaud the efforts that you make, and one other, again, to plug an OECD statistic, is what's called a resilience measure. It looks at the performance of students from a disadvantaged background that attend schools with peers that are more advantaged. And on this score, we do really well, better than almost all countries. And this, again, I guess gets to the argument that you make, is that students that come from a disadvantaged background that are able to attend schools that aren't suffering from that same disadvantage in the community do really well. And that's something that can be applauded, that the programs like you've described can help families to do that. When it comes to discussions about choice, and there are many other kinds of policy tools and levers that are available to policymakers in the US particularly, that are especially to do with the question about access to alternatives to the local school for disadvantaged students. It's nothing that's on the table here other than what's called a choice and affordability fund, broadly put, that the government announced a couple of years ago and is due to come to us with a response in the next month, I believe, with some more details. That might be interesting to us around what opportunities that brings about, but ostensibly that might be a tool that could be of assistance there.
If I might, look, I applaud your work, sir. Thanks for sharing it. Your foundation does such great work. The whole notion of school choice is predicated that one size does not fit all. And that applies equally to Indigenous communities, Indigenous families and Indigenous students. So, and you say once you take away the financial barrier, then the choice becomes real. And for the choice to become real, practical and accessible, the choice needs to be affordable and the price pain point at a level which is tolerable and not painful, which was one of the massive issues we had with the Malcolm Turnbull Simon Birmingham funding model, is that it did assume a level of fees in Catholic schools, sometimes triple and quadruple the amount of fees. It would have decimated school choice and a massive disturbance to the policy settings in the school sector in this country. And Malcolm still wears the scars of that policy decision. But and with there's 2,100 odd students in Catholic boarding schools tonight in this state. A great many number of them are Indigenous, and year on year, the Catholic sector's percentage of Indigenous children in our system is growing by big leaps year on year. Some of our schools do fantastic work in collaboration with your foundation, and there's very clearly not enough in terms of numbers available, but the bursary programs and other offerings, St Joseph's at Hunters Hill, St Scholastica's in Glebe, my old school Stanislaus in Bathurst, dedicated programs where actually they go out and make sure that they hit their targets and go to areas of need and make sure the opportunity is extended, not only with partnering with your foundation, but other opportunities. So there's more work to be done.
Colette, one more question, I think, because it's just about 7:30.
Sorry,
No, go
the
ahead.
Independent School Voice. I'm Colette Coleman, I'm from the Independent Schools Council of Australia. Fantastic discussion about choice. I guess I just wanted to add a couple of points, and it's sort of coming from the discussion we've just had. The focus tonight on independent schools has actually sort of come across as being a high fee choice. 10% of our schools have no fees at all, and they're the schools that are the Indigenous community schools, special assistance schools, which are alternative schools for kids who have been disengaged from schools across every sector, and special schools. The median fee in an independent school is $5,000. So I think we are actually, perhaps 40 years ago, we were more traditionally high fee, but certainly because of the various needs-based funding models over the last 40 years, we're now, I think we can say, you know, an affordable choice for many families. The other thing I just wanted to do was research that we have actually been doing supports all of the questions that have come up tonight. I can provide some answers in terms of why parents choose independent schools at least. Sort of the top three priorities are perceptions of quality teaching, facilities, and values. In terms of religion per se, around 85% of independent schools are faith-based, but religion itself is actually around about priority number sort of 7 or 8. It is more values rather than a particular religious faith, which is driving parental choice as a result of our research. But it is those other things like facilities, teaching and values that certainly we're finding parents are saying are driving their choice of independent school. And certainly the other really surprising thing is even in primary schools, children have a big say in which school they go to, which is reflecting what Michael was saying as well.
Thank you. I have a sense that there are a number of people here who would benefit from connecting to others, which is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm putting my hand up to be a clearinghouse. So if you'd like to get in touch with me, very happy to put you in touch with, oh my goodness, I just had a thought about how many that might be, but very happy to pass on details and so on. So if you have any questions for us, of course we will respond, but please contact us. I know there were more questions, and I'm sorry we've run out of time. I'm about to hand over to Tom Switzer, our CEO, to make the final remarks.
Great. Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you to our panellists, Dallas, Michael, Dianne and Glenn, who is obviously the author of the major report we're launching here this evening and who has, as a result, been fielding many media inquiries. I think in the last 24 hours he's been in all the News Limited tabloids, The Australian, the 9 newspapers, so The Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Financial Review. He's on Channel 7 tonight, I think Radio 3AW. I've probably missed a few, but more power to you all. As Fiona mentioned, I'm running the think tank, the Centre for Independent Studies, and we've been around since 1976. It's a long time, more than 40 years, and we've been very much engaged in debates surrounding productivity, economic reform, culture, Indigenous affairs, China policy, healthcare. But we're particularly proud of the role that we've played in the education debates. We've been a leading player in the debates about school choice, as you've heard this evening, but we've also challenged many conventional wisdoms, whether it be questioning the Gonski school funding model, defending the NAPLAN school standards policy. And we're motivated not simply by any ideology to reduce the size and the scope of the government, although that's important, but we're primarily motivated by a desire to help disadvantaged students. We just happen to believe that school competition, parental choice, limited bureaucracies are the best ways of helping disadvantaged students. But as we've been shown tonight, it's quite clear that we're not an echo chamber. We like to hear different points of view. And Dianne was, among others, pushing back on some issues of school choice, and we've heard some of the questions tonight reflecting that point of view. So we subscribe to the great 19th century British liberal, John Stuart Mill, who said, "Those who know only his own view knows little of that." In other words, if you only know your own view, you don't really know much about it. It's only when you've been subjected to intense scrutiny and been tested by the opposite side, you know the strengths and weaknesses of your own argument, and I think it's fair to say we've heard that this evening.